Well, good evening again to the 11th episode of the course being taught this spring at the University of Kansas, the Biography of a City, Lawrence. Before we begin the presentations for this evening, I'd like to refer you back to the session we had on William Burroughs. I got a letter from James Grauerholtz, who participated on that panel, and he asked me to read a short correction. James Grauerholtz, who spoke about the author Burroughs' 16-year residence in Lawrence on March the 3rd, asked me to convey a clarification. James mistakenly mentioned the Boops Adam Alumni Center, and by extension the Alumni Association, in the context of an opportunity missed by the university in 1986 to become the home of Mr. Burroughs' literary archives. James wishes to apologize for that mistake and to acknowledge that the Alumni Association and its magazine, Kansas Alumni, have always been warmly supportive of Mr. Burroughs during his many years in Lawrence. And certainly the enthusiastic university-wide cooperation obtained by the organizers of the Ports of Entry exhibition at the Spencer Art Museum and the Nova Convention Revisited event at the Lead Center, both in late 1996, demonstrate that to a great many people working at the University of Kansas, Burroughs' life in Lawrence did matter to them. Our first speaker this evening is Professor Barkley Clark, who was born in Denver, Colorado, received a BA degree in history from Amherst, and finished his law degree at Harvard Law School. He then practiced law in Denver and was appointed to the Denver Urban Renewal Authority, which got him interested in local government as well as the classes he took at Harvard Law School in local government. He came to the University of Kansas in 1969 to teach at the law school, and he remained there until 1985 teaching commercial law and local government. He was appointed to the Lawrence Planning Commission in 1970, and that led then to 3 terms on the Lawrence City Commission, 1973, 1977, and 1981, and he was elected 2 terms as the mayor of Lawrence. After he left Lawrence in 1985, he went to Washington, D.C., where he taught at George Washington University for 4 years, and then he returned to Kansas City to practice law at Shook, Hardy, and Bacon, the largest law firm in Kansas City, where he practices commercial and banking law. He now is adjunct professor at the KU Law School as well, and he recently served as legal counsel to a special commission that integrated Wyandotte County government and Kansas City, Kansas government into a single political entity. Great pleasure to have you, Barkley. Thanks a lot for coming all the way from Kansas City.
Thank you, Dennis. Enjoy being here. I'll doff this coat if I may. I was interested to hear that William lived in Lawrence for 16 years. That's exactly the same period of time that I lived here. I feel in very select company with him. It was a wonderful 16 years because it's a wonderful town. And Dean Domer and I were having dinner tonight at Teller's down on Massachusetts Street. And after I finished, I kind of drove around and I went up and down Massachusetts and Vermont and through parts of Old West Lawrence and drove around other areas and was very pleased to see that the city seems to be thriving in every way. When I was at KU, the concern was always that the student enrollment would drop off a cliff, and that has never happened. In fact, it seems to have gone up and up to the point where I think now at about 27,000, it's certainly one of the larger universities, state universities in the country. And the city itself, of course, is prosperous. I have a lot of friends. We have a lot of people in our law firm who live in Lawrence and commute to the law firm, either in downtown Kansas City or in Corporate Woods in Overland Park. And I also have a number of friends who live in Topeka or who work in Topeka and live in Lawrence. So it really, truly is developing into almost a continuous community from the west edge of Topeka all the way to the eastern edge of Kansas City. And you could see that beginning when I was here, when I was living here, with the completion of K-10 and the beginning of development along the K-10 corridor. And that has continued, and my guess would be that that in the year 2020 or so, we'll see almost sort of a continuous area, which in a way is a shame, because it's always seemed to me that some of the farmland in the world is in the Cobb Bottoms between here and Kansas City. And I suspect a lot of that will stay as it will, but it's such an attractive place, I think, to live, that we're going to see continuing economic boom and continuing population growth. I think Lawrence in many ways is an ideal place to live, because you've got so many amenities with KU and Haskell here. You've got a good job base, and you have a very, very pleasant place in which to live. And I know a lot of people who work in Kansas City certainly feel that way. I also feel like I can just take a tiny little bit of pride in where the city is, because we really did do an awful lot of fun and exciting things, I think, back in the 1970s. As I look back on it now, it seems to me it was kind of a halcyon period, a period where, except at the very front of it, there's a minimum of chaos and a maximum of controlled growth and development in the city, and an improvement in the economic base of the town, and a continued strength on the part of KU and Haskell. It's a very unique city, and I was always especially proud to be mayor of Lawrence, because the community has got such an interesting chemistry, where you've got the university pretty much in the center of town geographically, the big university, and very much an impact on a day-to-day basis in the entire city. And then you've got wonderful other institutions like Haskell, and it really makes for an extremely interesting community. The period that I want to talk about right now is the decade of the 1970s, and that was I think a particularly prosperous and interesting and good period of time, and you can see a lot of the seeds planted in that decade which are present now. And by the way, I want to stress that if you have any questions as I go through, rather than formally waiting for them at the end and taking them then, I'd rather you ask them while they're hot, and hopefully I can answer them. And at least I'll certainly try. The first year of that decade, as Dean Domer indicated, I arrived myself here in 1969, in the summer of '69, and it was an incredible period of time. I understand that you had a discussion last week on the 60s in Lawrence, and I tell you, I felt that. I had been practicing law in Denver for 4 years, and I thought, you know, I'm going to a wonderful ivory tower. I'm going to teach at a fine law school and a great university, and this is going to be a nice, quiet, contemplative, academic environment. And boy, was I surprised. I got here the summer of '69, and there were all kinds of ROTC problems. But the real hit came in the spring of 1970, the very first couple of months of this decade of the '70s. And I remember I was working late in my office in what is now Lippincott Hall, what used to be Old Green Hall. I was working late on a book, and I heard this funny sort of crackling sound outside my window. I had a window right on Jayhawk Boulevard. And I heard this funny sound, and I walked out, and I noticed it was unusually warm. And even though this was, I believe it was April 20th, 1970. And I walked out, and I walked into the middle of Jayhawk, and I saw several hoses on the street. And I walked over to the Danforth Chapel, that beautiful little jewel in the middle of the campus, and I looked down the street, and there was the Student Union, flames going 150 to 200 feet into the air. I could not believe it, although you could sort of tell that the stage was set for anything. The United States had just made incursions into Cambodia in the Vietnam War just a couple of weeks before. The draft was in full swing, of course, at that time, and almost none of you lived through that era to remember it directly, probably, but it was a pretty wild situation because we were in the middle of a war that really nobody liked, and even though some people were sort of automatically supporting the U.S. position, nobody really liked the war. It wasn't a fun war with a clear good and evil situation in it, and it led to tremendous division and strife, and I'm sure you did in detail last week. And that was certainly true on the campus. There were also racial problems, and there had been a death of a young black man in East Lawrence, and that was a problem. In fact, he was really a boy. He was about, I think he was 11 years old at the time. And then there was an ROTC student who was killed on the campus by, nobody could tell if it was a stray gunshot or what it was. But we had 2 deaths, and the ultimate property destruction was that night when the student union went down. And there were a lot of students that night who were running into the building and trying to grab paintings off the wall and bring them down, and saved a lot of things from the Union. But the thing that struck me, and it was kind of, to me, in a way, it was almost a paradigm, a perfect example of this whole era. I was standing outside at the Danforth Chapel looking down in amazement. I'd never seen a fire like it. It was really very hot. That's a couple hundred yards away. It was very hot. And the president of the student body was standing right next to me with his arms folded in back, and he was kind of weaving back and forth. I don't know whether he had, I'm just not sure, but he was kind of weaving back and forth, and he looked up at the flames and he said, "Out of sight." And to me, that kind of summarized the whole era. I mean, it was just, everybody was kind of half dazed and crazy. And but the flames came to an end. There were some other problems that happened. There was a fire bombing at Summerfield Hall, a school of business, and there were some other injuries. One of the bad things that happened that night in 1970 was that, and it happened for a couple weeks before that, was that there had been a number of small fires set on the campus, and the fire department had come up, and there were sabotaging of the fire engines. I mean, it got to be that bad. And you can imagine at that period of time, because so much of the turmoil seemed to be coming from Mount Oriat, it really created tremendous town-gown tensions in a way that I don't think has occurred before, and certainly in a way that has not occurred since. It was just a very, very tense situation, and it wasn't true just in Lawrence. It was true in other places too, but I'm not sure that other cities, other university towns, suffered 2 deaths and the kind of property loss with the destruction of the Kansas Union. But that was my introduction. I said to myself at the end of that night, what in the world have I done? Is this an amazing mistake or what? But things began to settle down after that chaotic first year of the decade, 1970. The draft was finally away with, and by the time, I would say, the fall of 1971, things had really pretty much settled down, and now suddenly the focus on the part of students was more getting a job, doing well in school, and the whole concern about global politics had kind of been deflated. It was as though we'd expended all this energy for this period of time, and then there was kind of a bursting of it, and everything kind of deflated from there. And for the rest of the 1970s, I think it was a very different time. Throughout the 70s, then there were other things like streaking across the football field. And I remember I was the victim, and several others in town were the victim of the Brotherhood of Pie-Face Assassins, which was a group of sinister people who took pies. And for example, one time I was lecturing in a class at the law school, and the door opened and back turned around, and these 2 guys ran up and slapped me with these 2 pies. And I was stunned, but I figured I was kind of in good company there because the chancellor had taken a hit the day before, and so I figured it was a pretty good deal. But after licking the pie off, I went ahead and tried to finish the lecture. But it was kind of pranky things like that seemed to dominate the middle and late 70s, and you didn't have that tremendous edge to it that you had I'd say the period 1967 to early 1971 was really the center point of that. But that was my first year in Lawrence, and I really got a very strong first-hand view of it. As Dean Domer mentioned, when I was in Denver, I'd been in Denver before. I was a native of Denver, and after going to the East Coast to school for 7 years, I'd come back there and practice law. I was on the Denver Urban Renewal Authority, and we started the Downtown Urban Renewal Project. Any of you in Denver recently know that LODO, it's called, the Lower Downtown Denver, really that urban renewal project has worked out very well. Coors Field is down there now, Larimer Square, and it's a very vibrant area. But urban renewal in the 50s and 60s was by and large a disaster around the country. Because what happened was the federal government would, you'd have a local urban renewal commission, it would clear an area of land, and often displacing many, many people in the process. And then the land would be sold at a reduced price to a developer who would then build brand new buildings that the people who used to live there could not afford. Well, fortunately in Denver, the area we renewed in lower downtown was just basically warehouses. And I think also fortunately, we've never had really an urban renewal project in Lawrence. Those projects were pretty much limited to the larger cities, and we've had a number of rehabilitation, some quite successful, but no wholesale urban renewal project, and I think that is a real blessing. But that's sort of where I got baptized into the area of local government, and I was fascinated by it because it seemed to me that this is the one area of government where I could serve. It would be a sort of an immediacy with my constituency. I could do it consistent with my job, and I wouldn't have to be subject to the kinds of pressure in a way that you are when you are in the state legislature or Congress, where it becomes an all-consuming thing. Because the theory of local government in Lawrence was then and is now that you serve as a citizen representative for a while and then you leave. I think my tenure on the city commission was probably the longest of anybody, and it was 10 years, which is a long time. But but I always felt that there was nothing a professional politician. One of the beauties of city government in Lawrence is that it's completely nonpartisan. At least city government is nonpartisan. County government is partisan, but city government is not. That, I thought, was a wonderful thing. I never knew who my fellow city commissioners, whether they were Democrats or Republicans or independents. Sometimes you could maybe try to guess from the votes on different issues, but formal party politics was really pretty much irrelevant. And I think that's been one of the secrets of local government in this city for a long time. And if you get the right people serving and people who are dedicated and anxious to do a good job for the city rather than for a particular party or formal set of ideologies, I think probably the city benefits from that. But it was an exciting time to serve. Very soon after I got here, and one of the things that amazed me is here I was, a brand new person in the summer of '69, and yet by 1973 I was on the city council, and by '75 I was mayor of the city. And that always struck me as an amazing thing, that you could come into a city like this. Particularly when I was a member of the university faculty, and I was a little bit concerned that, well, there's going to be a town gown split with all of this stuff going on, with Vietnam and everything swirling around. It seemed to me that that would polarize the community in terms of electing people to city offices. But it didn't really work out that way. And very soon after I got here, I went over and saw the mayor. And I asked the mayor if I could serve on some commission. And he said, yeah, you want to be on the planning commission? I said I'd been on the Denver Urban Renewal Authority. He said, sure, you want to be on the planning commission? Would you like that? And I said, yeah, it'd be great. And about 2 weeks later, I was appointed on the planning commission. And then for the next couple of years, worked in the area of city planning, zoning, which is a fascinating area, and special use permits and that kind of thing. That led me in 1973 to run for the city commission, because I wanted to be sort of broader in my scope of local government involvement. And I was teaching that at the KU Law School, and I was very interested in local government. And it seemed above all that serving in a city like Lawrence, you could have an immediacy of impact. You know your constituents, they're your neighbors. There are some bad parts to it. I got calls in the middle of the night because dogs were running loose in people's yard. If people's trash didn't get picked up, they would be furious. People put pressure on you to go for or against prospective zoning changes. I mean, there's a lot of immediacy in local government, but at least it pretty much limited itself to the various issues that we had, and I think it was a very exciting period. I hope some of you, I know a lot of you are history majors, and I hope some of you consider when you graduate and after you've taken jobs in various positions to consider local government, even if you only do it on a part-time basis. And in Lawrence, it's non-compensatory. We used to get $100 a year. The amount has gone up slightly, but it's nothing that you can live on, that's for sure. But it always struck me, that was the right way to have it. But in a community of this size, it's not too big, and yet it's big enough that we were doing really interesting things. And of course, the city is still that way. About the same time that I came to Lawrence, I remember noting in the paper, I've just been there a couple of months, that the city had hired a new city manager. It was a guy by the name of Buford Watson, and he had been an MPA student at KU and had been a manager in a number of other cities, smaller towns around the Midwest, and was appointed city manager here by the city commission. That's one of the commission's big jobs, is to appoint the city manager. And I got to know him pretty quickly, and he struck me as a very sensible guy, a really fine person. And in fact, in my view, the success of Lawrence in the 70s and 80s is very much attributable to him and his vision. He was a warm guy who was really interested in seeing the city grow. He understood the importance of growth and a strong economic base for a city like Lawrence, but he also wasn't crazy about growth and was saying that growth is going to take place on a controlled basis within a proper framework. And we always had during the 70s kind of an undergrowth of a little, a no growth versus fast growth mentality. And I've always thought that one of the tricky things and one of the most important things being on the city commission was to try to kind of walk a middle line there, to encourage growth, because you had to have that property tax base continuing to grow. If you don't do that and you're trying to increase services and you've got to increase wages for firefighters and policemen and so on, and your tax base is flat, it means everybody's tax rate is going to go up, or you're going to have to pass additional taxes. But as long as that ad valorem tax base is rising like this, you can keep the rates at about the same level, and the increased tax base will then finance the improvements in services. So it always struck me that that kind of a line, healthy growth, but not growth that is off the chart, like we've seen, for example, in Johnson County. There are some towns that have just been growing so fast it's incredible. And some other university towns, Austin, Texas would be an example, Boulder, Colorado, have grown topsy-turvy, even though in many respects they have tried to stop it. But I've always thought that Lawrence was doing it about right, that the growth level was pretty good. And I think Buford, as the city manager, kind of set the tone for that. And he was a great mentor for me, and I think a number of the other city commissioners during that period of time. And I was just having a great time in local government and trying to kind of learn my way around, and learning a great deal from him. Because, of course, under our city government system in Lawrence, and this is true around the country, and by the way, this university has played a great role in that. This university, through its public administration program, has graduated more people who end up as city managers and other professionals in various cities than probably any other university. It's got the #1 program in the country, and a lot of the reason I think that the city manager form of government is as strong as it is, particularly in this part of the country, is due to the role that the university has historically taken in it. But Buford was a product of that, and I think taught me that one of the best things that we had going for us in terms of city government was the form of government. And it was this. You had a city manager who ran the city on a day-to-day basis. You still have it today. I was fortunate enough to help in the hiring of Mike Wilgen, who is the current city manager and was Buford's understudy. But you have the city manager who runs the city on a day-to-day basis. and then all of the various departments under the city manager, police, fire, parks and recreation, and so on. And then you have what I would call a board of directors, the city commission. And in Lawrence, that's 5 people elected at large, not from subdivisions within the city, not from subdistricts. And that, I think, is also very important. Elected at large on a nonpartisan basis to set policy for the city, to hire and fire city managers. I used to say, every week it just takes 3 votes to fire me, so I better remember my good manners. And indeed, that's one of the main responsibilities of a city commission, to hire and fire a city manager. We were lucky we never had to do that, but it's a key responsibility. The other responsibility is to set policy, to vote on the big policy issues, and then let the city manager and his staff implement those. Now that, to me, in my 10 years of city government during the 70s, was one of the key issues. What is the proper role of the city commission vis-a-vis the city manager? And we had times when there were certain members of the commission, I think, sometimes that were sort of on one side, would want to get more involved in the management of city government on a day-to-day basis. Some others were totally hands-off. Others were kind of in the middle on that. But it always seemed to me that that's one of the trickiest things, to try to be activist and set an appropriate role as a member of the board of directors, elected directly by the people. But don't try to run the city on a day-to-day basis, and let the city manager handle the details. It's very analogous to a corporation where you have a board of directors and then you have a CEO who really runs the company. You have a board of regents and then you have a chancellor. I mean, many organizations in American society are set out that way. And I always felt that it was great fun, because I could do the job on the board of directors and go to my roughly twice weekly meetings and yet not be totally consumed by the job as you'd have to be if you were a city manager or an assistant city manager. Yeah, Dennis?
What was the role of the mayor?
Interesting question. What was the role of the mayor? We talked about this during the 70s and talked about whether maybe we should change the role of the mayor. In Lawrence then, as now, there is no election of the mayor. The mayor is chosen by fellow city commissioners. Every year there is an appointment at the beginning, right after elections, of the mayor. And the city commissioners choose one from among the 5 of them to serve as mayor of the city. And there had long been a tradition that the person who got the highest number of votes, 3 people are elected every 2 years, the person who got the highest number of votes in the last election would become mayor 2 years after serving. The person who got the second highest number of votes would become mayor 3 years after, and then the whole process would begin again. And that's the way I became mayor, not by a direct election. I just ran for the city commission, but chosen based, I was lucky enough to come out first in the election the first 2 times I ran, and so I became mayor in both cases the 3rd year after I got on the commission. The mayor is a weak mayor position in the sense that, not being directly elected by the people and simply being one of equals really on the city commission, the mayor didn't have any particular power base or source of authority. And when you add nonpartisanship to that, I think that simply emphasized it. So, but the mayor's role ended up being chairing the various city commission meetings, meeting on Tuesday nights. Boy, did I go to a lot of Tuesday night meetings for years and years and years. And chairing those meetings, doing a lot of things like ribbon cutting, and setting the agenda, working with the city manager and setting the agenda for the city commission. We would have sometimes trips that you'd have to make to Washington to dip our hands into the pork barrel, to lobby various funds for the city. And if there was just to be a single representative, that would normally be the mayor. The mayor would play a special role on the League of Kansas Municipalities with other mayors in the state of Kansas. And so it was ceremonial and also running the meetings. That was really the big thing. But I did find that during my 2 terms as mayor, I tried extra hard to kind of forge together alliances to get things done. I think when you're mayor and you're chairing the meeting, it's like anything else, you feel a special responsibility for achieving things and getting things done. So, but that was the general role. Another question was, is it good to have at-large elections? Well, I think it is. I always felt it was great because I never felt that I had to represent a particular neighborhood or a particular constituency in town. My job was to try to represent everybody as best I could. Lawrence is not big enough yet, I don't think, where it requires sub-districts within the city. And I had to run on my elections city at large, which was more difficult than just running in a fifth of the city. But I always felt pleased that it was nonpartisan and that it was at large, so that at least theoretically I could feel like I was representing everybody. Let me tell you of another concern that I had all during my period on the City Commission. It is what I would call the Jeffersonian Burkean continuum. Jefferson and Edmund Burke represented two poles of representative theory. Jefferson's theory was kind of, if the people give you a mandate, you follow what they want. If they have a referendum on something, you follow that. Your role is to act as the mouthpiece of the people. The Burkean view was, your role is to exercise your own independent judgment. If the people don't like you, they can throw you out. But just because there's a referendum on something and the people vote 60-40 in favor of it doesn't mean necessarily that you have to push that as part of your agenda. You are up there, you are elected to exercise your own independent judgment. And I felt all during the 10 years on the City Commission that there was a constant tension between representing or reflecting views that I knew were out there and exercising my own independent judgment. I tried to kind of balance the two as best I could, but I guess if I were to put myself in a poll, it would be more perhaps over on the Burkean view, on the theory that if people didn't like the way I was exercising my judgment, they have the ultimate right at the ballot box to throw me out the next time. As I mentioned before, and just going down this list on the outline here, that the town-gown relationships, I was concerned about them at first, but it turned out a problem. I mean, the people outside of the university who were working in my election supported me warmly, and it just never was a problem, and I don't think has ever really since been a big problem here, even though I was concerned about it because of the way things were exploding in the very early part of the 1970s. Another thing that happened that kind of set the stage for the 70s was that in about 1968-69, even though Lawrence didn't have an urban renewal program, it got its first federal grant. The mayor at that time was a very, very talented woman by the name of Nancy Hamilton. And she was the mayor of the city. And she went to Washington to lobby to get Lawrence's first grant. And we got it. I think there was an attitude maybe before then, well, maybe we don't really want these grants, but certainly view had changed by the late 60s. So we went and got a grant. I think it was something like $350,000 or $400,000 from the Department of Urban Development. And it was a grant to beef up the downtown. There was a recognition in Washington in those days that downtowns in smaller and medium-sized towns were dying right and left. And they were dying in part because of big cornfield malls that were starting to go in all over the country. And they'd go in not in the downtowns, but they'd go in somewhere in the suburban area, and they would suck all the lifeblood out of what used to be the main street. And so I remember my first public policy issue when I was on the commission was the idea of helping to implement this downtown community grant. And that kind of set the tone for me. And I always felt it was one of my utmost priorities to try to keep downtown Lawrence strong and to try to, as really the main shopping center and the center of gravity of the town, which is very difficult to do. If you think about Lawrence geographically, the downtown is really kind of on in the northeastern corner of the city. It's not centrally located. The KU campus is pretty central, but the downtown is kind of off to one side. And so it seemed to me that created even an additional threat. What did we do? What did the city do with that money? Put in trees up and down Massachusetts. put in sawtooth curbs to make the downtown more attractive, and perhaps above all, put in off-street parking lots off of downtown, particularly on New Hampshire Street and Vermont Street. And the idea was to try to encourage people to come down. You have to have adequate parking. But we tried to stay away like the plague from big, huge expanses of concrete. And they really destroy the feeling of the Main Street USA, which was a great thing Lawrence had going for it. Because a lot of those buildings, the facades of those buildings and the buildings themselves, date from the early part of the century, and some of them go back even further than that. So it was the sort of situation where we felt we had to keep that going. And I think it was riotously successful. It wasn't a great, huge project. It was our form of urban renewal. But it didn't displace anybody, really. It was done with the cooperation and the strong sponsorship, really, of the Downtown Merchants Association. And it was extremely successful. And I think I learned then, that was about I guess 71, when I was just on the Planning Commission at that time. I learned then that you've got to do everything you can to try to keep the downtown strong and to keep the special amenities that you have in the city. So that was really sort of I always felt a kind of a priming of the pump. And what other things happened in the 70s that were, I think, very, very important? One of the great trends of the 70s was the growth of neighborhood associations. The first one in Lawrence was the Old West Lawrence Association. And you know where the Old West Lawrence neighborhood is. It's a lot of those wonderful old Victorian homes along Indiana and Mississippi Street in the 700, 800 blocks, 600 block, just west of downtown. And that was really the center of gravity in Lawrence in the late 19th century. And it's a wonderful old neighborhood. And they banded together to form a neighborhood association. Well, one thing I noticed on the Lawrence City Commission was that sort of set the model. That was the model. And after that, we had in the 70s the development of the East Lawrence Association, the Oriad Neighborhood Association, the Pinckney Neighborhood Association, the North Lawrence Neighborhood Association. And I would say if there's a common denominator among those, we didn't have one, for example, of the Alvamar Neighborhood Association, really. I think that and I know Dean Domer's going to be talking more later about Alvamar. I think the neighborhood associations were the ones that had most of the older housing and that felt that maybe they were, if anything, sort of the have-nots in town, that most of the emphasis of new streets and new amenities going along with this explosive development west of Iowa Street was going away from them. And so they counteracted that by banding together in groups. And it was extremely effective. We would have Lawrence City Commission meetings on any number of topics. How to spend revenue sharing, whether to go for a particular zoning change, and you would have representatives of the neighborhood groups down there in droves. And that makes a difference when you're sitting there at the table and you're elected by the people in the city. It's that Jeffersonian idea. And the neighborhood association says, don't change that zoning from residential to commercial. That's going to kill our neighborhood. Or we demand that you put a stop sign in at some location to slow down traffic. Or we would like you to spend some of your money on a neighborhood building for us, a neighborhood association building where we can have various kinds of community activities. And that lobby effort was tremendously successful all during the 70s, and I think that's continued on through the 80s and 90s. And so I think that part of town, even though I think probably there were some people who say, well, we still get the short end of the stick. I think in terms of the amount of time that the City Commission took listening to that, to those voices was extremely strong and extremely influential. So that was very much a grassroots democracy kind of thing. These people weren't elected. They just banded together as neighborhood associations. But they had a great impact on a lot of things that that happened. The project for the sawtooth curbs and the trees and the off-street parking along Massachusetts was really the tip of the iceberg. That happened about 1970. But as we got deeper into the 70s, we had more and more federal money. It was the time of big federal bucks. And there were two kinds of federal programs, both of which we used to, I think, pretty good effect. One was what we would call block grants. Grants from the federal government. You can use money, you can get money, but there are certain strings attached. If you want the money, follow certain federal guidelines. The second group was general revenue sharing. And the Congress enacted general revenue sharing in about 1973. And it was extremely successful because what happened, at least from a local government point of view, because what happened was, based on your population, the federal government would give you a blank check. And most taxpayers gasp when they think about this. But people in local government thought it was the greatest thing, manna from heaven. We got checks, $500,000, $600,000 a year from the federal government to spend the money as we will. The theory was, let's not have a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington telling you how to spend your money and coming out and policing everything you do. Let's let the people who are closest, let's let the governments who are closest to the people decide where their priorities are and how to spend the money. So there were virtually no strings attached to revenue sharing. That program is now gone. I'm sorry to say, I think it was a great program. But it was truly in its heyday in the 1970s. So we took advantage of both block grants, and probably the most important ones were community development grants. You go to Washington, you can get a grant for $350,000, but you have to spend it to rehab old housing. And we really, as a matter of public policy, went after that grant money very hard. And we got community development funds to give to individual neighbors $5,000, $6,000 so that they could fix up their homes. We also had a low-cost loan program, low-interest loan program, where we could actually make loans to people to fix up their homes in the older areas of town. Not in the new areas, but in the older areas of town. All of this was called neighborhood redevelopment. That was kind of the keynote. And the emphasis was on old neighborhoods, and we did that a lot. What did we do with our general revenue sharing? Well, it was very interesting, because we were able to use that money for whatever we wanted to. And one of the things that we did was that we got together with the county. Historically, county government in Douglas County and city government in Lawrence went their own separate ways. The county commissioners handled roads in the county. They handled taxation. They handled a variety of other services. In the city, the primary emphasis was on police and fire and parks and recreation, streets. And often, never the twain shall meet. But because the county got revenue sharing money and the city got revenue sharing money, and you pooled it together in any given year and you had several $1 million, one day we met with the county commissioner and we said, hey, why don't we get together and sit of a unified government. And Dean Domer mentioned that we just got unified government through in Wyandotte County and Kansas City, Kansas, which I think is a big plus. But we sat as a unified government and said, let's pool the money and decide what's the best way to spend it so there's no overlap, duplication, and that kind of thing. And what we also did was, with this amount of money, we said, okay, how much are we going to expend on capital expenditures? Buildings, bricks and mortar. And how much are we going to put on people programs? And we kind of allocated. And we ended up spending about 80% on capital improvements and about 20% on people programs. And we did it with the county. And among other things, we sat down in the county, said, you know what we would like to do? We'd like to spend a lot of our revenue sharing money on redoing the law enforcement center at 11th in Massachusetts. We want to rehab the wonderful old county courthouse and build a new jail and law enforcement facility right behind the courthouse. And that's exactly what they did. And we spent some of our money for that. They spent the bulk of their money on that. That was their key project. And we said, well, we want to do some other things. We want to renovate the old Carnegie Library as a community center on 9th Street. We want to renovate another old building as an arts center, the Lawrence Arts Center. Then we want to renovate another old building as a community center. We want to take the old police station and make it into a senior center. And we had our own priorities on where to put our capital expenditures, and the county did. And we met together for a number of years there, and I thought it was a wonderful example of intergovernmental cooperation. And I'm not sure we've seen anything quite like it since, because we were lucky we happened to have the funds to do that with, so it brought us together on that basis. But it also meant that for the first time in history, city government was getting involved in what you might call United Fund type programs. We took 20% of our revenue sharing funds and we said, let's put some of it into mental health, let's put some of it into supporting the housing for battered women, let's do this and let's do that. And we had 10 or 15 different projects, which then we tried to fund every year with general revenue sharing money. Now the scary thing about that was, when is the government going to pull it away from us? And that was one of the main reasons we decided not to spend more of our money on what we would call these people programs. Because if they suddenly pull the rug out from under us and we spend most of our money on, let's say, increasing firefighter salaries or police officers' salaries, then where are you? You've got to raise your taxes to fill the gap or to keep them where they are. So a conservative view, and we ended up about 80-20. But I think in retrospect it ended up just about right. But that cooperation with the county, I think, was a very unique kind of situation we had then. As a matter of urban planning, here was another key concern during the 70s. Keeping downtown strong. Now, what can we do to do that? Well, we got the first project. But then it started coming into our minds that what we have to do is we have to anchor both ends of downtown. And so when the county rehabilitated the county courthouse, and when the Watkins Community Museum, which is a wonderful museum, you all ought to go through there if you haven't done that. It's a great historical museum. And the law enforcement complex, that was, and the development of that wonderful little park there with those public facilities, that was the south anchor. Well, we said, we've got to anchor the north end too. And in fact, in those days, the north end was a little shaky. 600 block on Massachusetts. So what we did was, we said, all right, we're going to build a new city hall. And for years we had leased space in the old First National Bank building, which is now the Mercantile Bank building, on 9th and Massachusetts. And we said, let's build a new city hall. We shouldn't be leasing property. Let's have our own city hall and make kind of a statement. And we did that, and we did that with revenue sharing money. We took our revenue sharing money, we issued bonds. Now this was kind of scary, it was a little risky, but we issued bonds so that we could borrow all the money now, and then the bonds would be paid off by revenue sharing over the next 5 years. And we dedicated revenue sharing money to the payment of those bonds. It's risky because if the government pulled it out, we'd have a problem. And because of that, we did a referendum. Issuing these bonds, they were general obligation bonds of the city. If revenue sharing went south, we would then have to make up the bond payments out of the tax revenues of the city. So people voted on that, and I'll never forget, it was one of the most exciting days in government that I ever had when we learned and originally thought that no way are people going to vote for this. And as a result, I think, of a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people, the new city hall was authorized. And we now have the new city hall down on the river as an anchor on the north end of downtown. And tied in with that was the idea that just like we have a park that's a key park, I don't know if any of you have been here in the summer and been to concerts in South Park there. I mean, it's a wonderful little community park. And we felt we needed something to balance that off on the north end too, again, to keep anchors on both sides, to make the downtown in the middle as strong as possible. And so what we did was we used part of our money and special grants from the Interior Department to develop the riverfront park and the levee, the top of the levee where you can run, and the park all the way along the river. And we did that in part by, as I guess it was part of an overall project with the City Hall. But the end result is that we've really got a pretty strong anchor on the north end and the south end. And that's why I was so pleased tonight as I was driving up and down Massachusetts to say to myself, you know, this has really worked well. It was always a good downtown, but it's better now than it's ever been. The other thing that we did was something we did not do, and this was the most contentious issue in 10 years of city government: the Cornfield Mall. Almost from the first day I got on the city commission, we had requests made by developers to build a cornfield mall, an enclosed mall with 3 or 4 stores, Sears, Dillard's, Ward's, and so on, other smaller stores, and to put it out somewhere south of town, because that's what every other city's doing. But I think everybody on the commission felt that that's the wrong way to go. If you do that, you're going to go through what Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, which is sort of comparable to Lawrence in a way, has gone through. Just suck the lifeblood out of the downtown. You end up with vacancies all the way up and down Main Street. And so what we decided to do is just to say, no, we're not going to do a cornfield mall. We're not going to allow it. We're not going to grant the zoning that would allow it to be done. And I know there's a similar big issue going on right now concerning the hospital. But in those days, it wasn't the hospital, it was the cornfield mall. And there was a big legal issue there. The big legal issue is exclusionary zoning. Does a city have a right to exclude somebody from building something if they want to put it in there and it's not a nuisance? And the long and short of it is that whole issue has been litigated before the courts. We've concluded, supporting the city, that so long as your decision not to grant mall zoning in the cornfield is tied in with a comprehensive plan, you're okay. You can't arbitrarily fence somebody out, but if you're doing it in line with a comprehensive plan, you're okay. And therefore, the mall has gone away, and we don't have the cornfield mall. We do have the outlet mall, and we have a smaller mall in North Lawrence on that end of town. But the big South mall, which everybody was afraid was going to take all the activity away from downtown, has never happened. And to me, that is the greatest single thing. It's not something that happened, but something that didn't happen. And that was a very consistent public policy position taken by both local governments, the city and the county. We also had during the 70s home rule, constitutional home rule. And Kansas has a strong tradition of home rule, where cities can do whatever they want to do as they don't conflict with state law. In some states, cities can't do anything unless state law authorizes them to do it. In Kansas, it's just the opposite, city home rule. So we were able to do a lot of these things, like bond the city hall with revenue sharing funds, because we had the legal authority to do it. So to me, it was a combination of having the funds in the way of block grants and revenue sharing combined with the legal authority in the form of home rule, and you put that together and you're able to accomplish quite a few things in the city during that period of time. Another big issue that was central there and continues to be central is, how do you attract jobs into town? And one of our main roles was to try to encourage clean industry to come into town and to create as many jobs as possible, to have that industrial base. And we made full and aggressive use of our powers, our legal powers. We would issue bonds so that the land was owned by the city. The city would then lease it to the developer, who would build the new plant. But because the city owned the land, it was city-owned property, and the financing costs were a lot less, because municipal bonds are tax-free, so you don't have to pay as high an interest rate. So the cost of financing were a lot less. We would pass that on to the lessee, whoever it might be, Packer Plastics or Kmart, whoever it was. And in return, they would say, okay, we'll come in and build our plant and create 250 or 300 new jobs for the city. So that was another major role for local government, and I think continues to be, because it's all consistent with this idea of having growth, controlled growth. You don't have the cornfield mall, you keep your downtown strong, but you've got to have that continuing increase in the tax base and that continuing increase in jobs to make the city really viable. Some other exciting things that happened during that period of time: I went to Washington and helped with the county to get the money for Clinton Lake. And also the money for Clinton Parkway, that of course goes on out 23rd Street extended all the way to the lake. And I think that was a real plus. So we really had some pretty good luck on various kinds of park improvements in the city during that period of time. There was always talk about circumferential roads around the city. And we thought for a long time what we really need is an East Lawrence bypass. We need a South Lawrence bypass so you can have traffic coming from the turnpike and looping around to the south and going into K10, particularly with K10 as strong as it is. And I know there's never been an East Lawrence bypass, in part because of the strength of the East Lawrence Neighborhood Association that really never wanted it the way some others wanted it. And I understand that there's still fights going on concerning the South Pass, and it still has not happened for a variety of reasons. And these are tough public policy issues. They get into all kinds of difficult issues. But I would say that road building, along with some of these other things, continues to be a major concern for city government. Well, the end result is that maybe calling them the sensational 70s is too much, but I think it was a very vibrant period during the 70s where we got a lot accomplished because of a legal authority and home rule and because of the wherewithal we had and the healthy tax base. And it was exciting for me to be on the Lawrence City Commission during that period of time and to feel that for 10 years I could sort of serve as a citizen who would go down and try to do my best for city government with a very immediate kind of impact. And I just hope that some of you will consider doing that yourselves, because I think local government will continue to maintain a tremendous interest and be of tremendous importance for all of us. Well, I appreciated to be here and your good attention, and the time went by in a hurry, and I'll be glad to try to answer questions maybe a little bit later if you haven't. Thank you very, very much.
I'm happy to reintroduce Dr. Michael Swann, who will pick up where he finished early on in the course on city building of Lawrence. Dr. Swann is Associate Dean of Architecture and Urban Design and Associate Professor of Architecture, and I'm Assistant Dean of Architecture, primarily responsible for Kansas City. He will pick up on city building from 1960 to the present, and then I will take a good strong look at Alvamar, our biggest suburb. Dr. Swann, thanks for coming back.
Well, it was certainly nice of Dennis Domer to invite me back. Even though I wasn't given enough time the first time around. So, what I want to do tonight, in the few minutes I've got before Dean Domer starts talking about Alvamar and West Lawrence, is finished describing the development of Lawrence's built-up environment, which we started in January, and I got up to World War II, about the 1950s or so. And what I have to say tonight, I hope, will serve as a context for what you just heard from Professor Clark, as well as for what you're going to hear later on then about Alvamar and West Lawrence from Professor Domer. I'm going to squeeze things down into 3 distinct periods of development that come up after World War II, and I think that'll simplify a little bit, and again, it'll help you identify trends and cycles in the development of the built environment in Lawrence. So let me pop onto the slides here. Whoa. Okay. We're good. I think that's where I wanted to be. Let's look first at this period, 1946 to 63. Let's call it the 50s, the post-war boom. Like other cities, Lawrence grew after World War II, and it wasn't inconsequential. During the 50s, the city's population jumped from about 23,000 to about 33,000, and those numbers include students at KU. So it's a 50% increase in the population over a very short period of time. New industries, an enlarged student population, and increased demand for housing pushed that was geographically contained to an existing frame of highways that bounded Lawrence at the time. Now, I can't understate the importance of highways in framing Lawrence, and guiding its growth and giving it a certain look and a certain shape and feel. Most of the post-war developments, I hope that's clear, most of the post-war developments reinforced the northern and southern edges of the highway grid, that is 6th Street and 23rd Street. The map that I just have up there now comes from Pete Shortridge's Kaw Valley Landscapes, and I think it's a very good illustration of just how Lawrence was framed and laid out in the middle part of the 20th century. And if you look at this map, may be difficult to detect here, but the fuchsia areas show developments concentrated mainly along 6th Street in the north, and in that area between Allen Fieldhouse, the southern part of the campus, in the center of the town, 19th Street to 23rd Street. That was a focus of growth in the 50s and early 60s. The 23rd Street strip was, as well as the Hillcrest area around 9th and Iowa. Downtown Lawrence during the 50s didn't grow much. Remodeling rather than new construction was the rule, as Massachusetts Street businesses started competing with the new shopping centers on the town's outskirts. The 1951 flood, which is shown in the slide here, hit North Lawrence again pretty hard, just as it did in the early part of the 20th century, as you recall from the talk in January. It had less of an impact on South Lawrence. And the CBD downtown, Massachusetts Street and 6th Street, shown here, remained pretty much unchanged, had the same circulation pattern, and it worked well into the 1960s. 6th Street changed a little bit during this time. It emerged as a strip between Massachusetts and Iowa. And here you're looking at the east end of 6th Street, all these auto-oriented businesses on the north side where Buford Watson Park is today. And then out on the west end of 6th Street, the predominant form of construction was the drive-through restaurant. Here's an A&W root beer stand from the 1950s. Again, very typical of a 1950s strip development just about anywhere in the Midwest. South of Allen Fieldhouse was another point of concentration in the 50s for growth. The large tract of land, as I said, between 19th and 23rd Streets emerged as a premier residential development. You're looking at Naismith Drive under construction here in 1957. In this area, as I said, south of Allen Fieldhouse became a focus for housing construction in that same period. And some of the more exotic homes in the region, these sort of California-style, low roof line, rancher-type homes, characterized what was going on at the time. In fact, I grew up, as I said last time, in Leavenworth, Kansas, and I remember my family taking Sunday over here to look at the things that were being built in Lawrence. They were far out. Okay? Compared to what was happening in Leavenworth. 23rd Street started to achieve the look of an automobile-oriented strip at the same time, particularly around the intersection with Louisiana. You're looking down at the old Dynamite restaurant at 23rd and Louisiana here. Here's another view of it. It was a real local landmark for quite a while out on 23rd. And then just to the west of it, this is an aerial view looking down at the beginning of the mall shopping center. And you can see in the background there, just west of what is the malls today, there was a drive-in theater, typical of the fringe area of an urban development. Okay, low-density land use, good way to hold things for speculation. The Hillcrest area also was developed with some pretty impressive residential areas and a huge shopping center at the core. This is a 1957 aerial view of Hillcrest, and you can see the shopping center there, 9th and Iowa, in the center of the slide. And this is the kind of rancher that was being constructed in the late 50s, early to mid 60s in that Hillcrest area east of Iowa. West of Iowa, as you know, and west of the Hillcrest Shopping Center, things were a little bit different. Again, and it shows today different housing stock, different road patterns, and so on. You have two fairly different developments going on at the same time. So after World War II, just to summarize, strips, shopping centers, and lower density tract developments appeared on the edge of Lawrence, and this presented, I think, the first real threat of any sort to the continued growth of downtown and its nearby neighborhoods. And this may be more or less what, again, Professor Clark was talking about when there was a sudden perception that the downtown needed to be preserved and strengthened and reinforced. Let's call the 70s, in this case, roughly 64 to 79. I'm jump-starting them here and going against other definitions, but let's call this a period in Lawrence for the boomers. And that's exactly what was going on. Between 1960 and 1980, the population of Lawrence jumped from 33,000 to 50,000. It almost doubled. Much of the growth had to do with students moving into Lawrence. KU enrollments jumped from 9,300 in 1960 to 24,500 in 1980. So this flood of students into Lawrence in the mid to late 1960s had an impact on just about everything that you saw around, particularly on the housing market, but also on retailing and services as well. So commercial development had to respond. And as a result, Lawrence started expanding beyond the highway grid. Can I go to a slide, please? This is, again, a little bit difficult to see. Is the pointer on? That's not. Okay. Well, if you look at the very center of that slide, oh, here we go. Let me out with the arrow. This is that original highway frame that we saw in the earlier map. Iowa, 6th Street, Massachusetts, and 23rd. And what you're looking at is a 1972 aerial view from 50,000 feet up of the built-up part of Lawrence. And you can see that a lot of the city had spilled out way beyond that highway grid by 1972. That included not just commercial development, but a tremendous amount of single-family building as well as multifamily construction. Let's look at another map, and that'll help show what's going on. Infrastructure, of course, had to respond to this big boom, demographic boom and construction boom. This is a map showing sewer districts in Lawrence. In the northwest corner, you can see the district that went in the, I think that's the late 50s. And then the university extension here in the mid part. And then this entire district was built in the 1960s, again, to accommodate growth in the city. So one of the most significant changes that was taking place was the extension of the university beyond Iowa, west to what was to become Castled Street. Here's a pretty simple map that shows, again, in the center of it, Kansas University. The right half existed before this period. The right half and the left half existed together afterwards. And again, what's going on here is that the university is, in a sense, serving as a kind of a growth corridor, a pole that's pulling growth around it in this period. Again, there's a lot of construction that's going on west of Iowa then, starting during this period. Here's the USGS building, an older brick building today west of Lawrence, or west of Iowa, just across from the dormitories. You all see that probably pretty regularly. And here's a 1969 view of Castled under construction. Okay? And some of us remember even before that. But that's the way things looked like out there in the late 60s. The downtown was also affected by this growth, and you've gotten a very good description of exactly what happened. It experienced, again, because of all these students coming to Lawrence and in traffic, tremendous congestion. And so in this view, I'm showing the early 1970s bridge across, again, across the Kaw River here, and then those parking lots that were described by Professor Clark off New Hampshire and off Vermont that really made the downtown nice and workable. You can also see in this slide the anchor that he describes, City Hall on the north end, which again marks the end of this period and the focus on making downtown work right. Hillcrest Shopping Center again grew tremendously during the 1970s. It became essentially a destination point, not just a little neighborhood spot, but a place that drew people from all over town. It became an important commercial node, in other words. This is a 1965 view of 9th and Iowa Street, and you can see the commercial buildup there, the new housing north of 9th along Iowa too. And again, there's tremendous growth of student housing all over during this period. This is that 9th Street corridor. There's great buildup of apartment complexes, again, between Massachusetts and Iowa during the 60s and 70s. 23rd Street, again during the 70s, is also growing. There's a concentration of automobile-oriented businesses, again, mainly because of the tremendous growth of housing south of 23rd Street. That was a big booming area during the 70s. Let me jump back and just identify this. You're looking down at 23rd and Louisiana. That's Rusty's on one side. You can see the housing tract that's gone up behind it at that point. The student housing, I remember going there quite often in the early 70s. This is just south of the malls. Right, shopping center there off 23rd. I mean, thousands of students were crowded into these places, and then there's a belt just south of there of single-family housing and a belt just south of there of multifamily, around 20 that went in during the same period. So you see rapid expansion of neighborhoods south of 23rd. And then if you look west on 23rd at an aerial view here in 1965 of 23rd and Iowa, and that's the intersection right down here. Let's look over here at a miniature golf course. It's set out there. This is that new housing that went in, as I said, in the early 60s, south of Allen Fieldhouse, down in that neighborhood. So a lot of land was being held, again, in speculation and turned over to low-density use because people saw development coming. East 23rd Street also started picking up a little bit of construction. This is the Knights of Columbus Hall, I think. Part of it is shaved off here. Out on East 23rd, and it was built in the early 70s. This is the kind of thing that previously would have been constructed downtown, a Masonic hall or something like that. And suddenly we see these kinds of institutions being located in Lawrence out on the fringes as well. South Iowa Street also starts to boom in the 1970s in Lawrence. It started taking on the appearance of a commercial strip. I mean, I remember a lot of laundromats, a lot of gas stations and things like that. And then in the early 70s, you start to see garden apartments just off Iowa Street. And even farther south, you start to see some residential development on large-size acreages, like we have out there today. Gaslight Village, which some of you are probably familiar with, really started expanding in the 1970s. Again, large student population. Mobile home park is bound to take off. So the 1970s really saw Lawrence burst its seams, extend way beyond the contained small Midwestern college town that it had been during the first 3 quarters of the 20th century. And that puts us at about the 1980s, a period I would call characterized by metropolitanization. This, again, of this connection with the Kansas City economy that really feeds the boom in Lawrence, just as Professor Clark said. Since 1980, Lawrence has grown tremendously. Its population has jumped from 53,000 in 1980 to about 70,000 or so today. And again, this demographic growth has fueled all sorts of changes in the built environment. Again, let me emphasize, the expansion of the city is very strongly linked to the connection with Johnson County and with the connection to the economy of greater Kansas City, the metropolitan area. The new wealth that's come into Lawrence because of that connection, I think, has been very important. It's had a profound impact on the city's face. Let me just show examples of 3 different kinds of things that have happened since 1980 in Lawrence. And again, as you know, they got their roots in the 70s with the work of the City Commission. First of all, some districts have undergone redevelopment, restoration, and infill. Secondly, some of the strips that you find in Lawrence have intensified tremendously. They've been revitalized and even extended. And then thirdly, new districts, new corridors, and some power centers have emerged in Lawrence since the 80s. Let me show you some examples of some districts that have experienced restoration, redevelopment, and infill. Downtown is obvious. Lawrence is now one of the most successful and unique downtowns in the region. A new bridge comes in at the start of this period, and it alters the circulation pattern downtown, which again contributes to that lack of congestion that makes Massachusetts Street quite nice. You heard about the sawtooth curbs, the amenities that were added along Massachusetts Street. These things really make it a very viable, very attractive place today, and they certainly did in the 1980s. The creation of an historic district along Massachusetts Street, again, has helped preserve the architectural integrity of that part of Lawrence and made it very attractive to people who are coming from areas that don't have that heritage present. Businesses like this, the Raven Bookstore down on 8th Street in Lawrence, make downtown, or 7th Street, make downtown very, very interesting. And at the same time, franchise businesses that come in limited numbers and that fit in architecturally can really add to the retailing base of downtown. The Gap here, Abercrombie and Fitch and so on, reinforce downtown strength. East Lawrence is another district that's undergone the same process to a certain extent. It's gone through pretty much a renaissance since 1980, again, because of its proximity to downtown, as the map here shows. You can see the residential areas clustered just to the east of downtown. Many homes in East Lawrence, of course, have been restored, well maintained, and it's a very attractive neighborhood today because of the effort that's gone into it, because of the neighborhood association that was formed. Old West Lawrence, you heard about earlier this evening. It's probably the best known example of neighborhood revitalization in Lawrence. We're looking at one of the typical Victorian homes, the Loomis House in Lawrence. But it's not just the houses and the street fronts that have been kept and maintained. It's the alleyways as well that are less visible that have been kept up too. The Oriad neighborhood, as Professor Clark says, is a very, very strong one. It's gone through a tremendous transformation since the early 70s. Lots of infill housing along those north-south running streets. Some of it has been successful, like this infill housing. I think this is along Kentucky. Some of it not quite as successful, not quite as sensitive to the neighborhood either. North Lawrence, again, is an area that was neglected for well over a century, and it's turned into one of the most interesting neighborhoods in Lawrence just in the last 20 years. This is the Union Pacific Depot that's been restored in North Lawrence. There's a very rich railroad heritage there, I think, that has gone unnoticed, and people are starting to pay attention to it today. The trail along the levee in North Lawrence is a really nice amenity to have there, and I think it has something to do with a renaissance population housing there. There's some infill housing from North Lawrence. Again, I've been up there and been surprised at the amount of construction that's going on there today. Some of the more visible changes have taken place, however, along the strips that you find in Lawrence, and they've undergone revitalization and new construction. This is North 2nd Street in Lawrence. You can see Riverfront Square. The Outlet Mall up near I-70, Tanger Outlet Mall, has high degree of visibility, and it has itself also become a destination point in the 1990s. West 6th Street, again, is another strip that has extended in this case in the 80s and 90s. The south side of 6th Street, as you know, is an almost continuous strip development now west of Iowa. Just go as far as you want to practically. And then with the construction of Free State High School, we've got something that's going to stimulate continued westward expansion along that arterial. So it's pretty easy to see where Lawrence is headed. 23rd Street, I mean, is the premier commercial strip in Lawrence today. This view west toward Iowa, near Alabama Street, shows how much commercial infill there's been. It's continuous development now. It's not just the Dynamite restaurant anymore. It's everything out to Iowa. And with that, you get this. This could be anywhere in southern Overland Park, this kind of congestion. It's kind of exciting in a sense, but it's also something that people like to avoid. So, more construction attracts more traffic. More traffic lanes attract even more traffic. Iowa Street is another strip that's taken off south of 23rd. In particular, this is a 1980 view north. On the right-hand side there, you can see Kmart when it first came in, as well as Gaslight Village to the north of it. And then we can take the same view looking south. There's the Lawrence Auto Plaza on the west side of Iowa Street. And then here it is today. North of those locations has been filled in. As I said, those used to be laundromats, gas stations, and so on. Today it's continuous strip development. There's a very brave pedestrian in the center of this slide. Very difficult to find, but the last of a dying breed. Okay. The new districts that have popped up in Lawrence are pretty plain, and Dr. Domer is going to talk about one of them tonight. I'll just introduce it. West Lawrence is one of the most important. Let me say these districts are to a certain extent disconnected from Old Lawrence. They have equally strong ties, I think maybe even stronger ties, to Johnson County than they do to Old Lawrence. And they have to be looked at in that way. Visually, they tend to resemble Overland Park more than they resemble Old Lawrence. I'm not saying that's good nor bad. It's just the way it is, the way I see it. This is a 1993 map. It's, again, difficult to read, but it shows new proposed and anticipated residential additions in Lawrence. My question is, how long can the downtown in Lawrence remain viable with this pattern of westward and southern development? And you can see most of what was going on in the early 90s is westward and southern. Here's a corner shopping mall at 15th and Castle. So far, this sort of strip commercial development along key roads is one way to respond to that and to stave off the need for a large single cornfield mall. Another thing that you find in West Lawrence, again, another landscape element, is the low-density research park. This is Oriad West Research Park. It's very typical of suburban areas all over the place. It has a tower here to give it a little bit of identity, and that works out very nicely, I think. But again, you have this fairly typical pattern of mixed single and multifamily housing. This is at Wakarusa in Clinton Parkway. And again, note how different the landscape here is from in the skyline, the roof, what you find in other parts of Lawrence. Again, neither good nor bad, just different. That's a new district that's popped up since 1980 and dominated the city. Secondly, there's the power center at 31st and Iowa that, again, we're all familiar with. This is a map showing commercial and residential development at that location. You can see, maybe, right here, here's Iowa Street running down, and here's the intersection with the proposed South Lawrence traffic way. This is going to be the most important node in a geographic sense in Lawrence, if it isn't already. This is a site plan for the Target store. It's built now. This dates from 1994. And you can see that sensitive phase development was considered in all the building down there. This stuff has not happened thoughtlessly. This is an aerial view looking north over that development. And you can see in the foreground the remnants of a farmstead there. Again, this is a story that's being repeated over and over again south of Lawrence. Farmland being taken over by a commercial and residential development. Something we need to pay particular attention to. Here's the Super Target today. Again, perfect example of big box architecture, which you can find at 119th and Metcalf, as well as 31st in Iowa, as well as many other locations in the United States. Lastly, Southeast Lawrence and the K-10 corridor, I think will really take off in the next 20 years. This is the Signal Quick Shop at 23rd and Harper. You have a quick shop where you need to buy gas and bottled soft drinks and orange juice and stuff. The people who want to buy that are people who are commuting. And they're going both ways on K-10 every morning, both into Lawrence and out of Lawrence, believe me. That tells us there's a lot of traffic out there. But you also have residential subdivisions as well. This is south of 23rd and Harper. And again, this is a little bit different from what you're going to hear about tonight. This is higher density, fewer amenities, probably lower priced housing going in that corner of Lawrence, creating a different landscape and different environment. Diversity is good in a housing market because you have to sell to all sorts of different levels. East Hills Business Park is also found in the southeast corner of town. Again, this goes back before the 80s, the planning for it, but it gives this corner of Lawrence a fairly different feel in its landscape quality. It's a true industrial district going in. And then a view of the K-10 corridor coming into Lawrence. This is the link, I say, that's having a very profound effect on the entire city. So I want you to remember that this is a very selective survey, visual survey that I've put in front of you tonight. It shows the variety of landscapes, buildings, and changes that we've seen so far. Now, to just summarize this, let me pop back to that model that I put up in January. It shows the transition in land use, essentially, of cities in the United States from the pedestrian city in the upper left-hand corner. Well, there we go. Very simple circular type model, all the way through to one that's oriented to trains, automobiles that follow arterials out and create new suburbs, to this sort of ring city with suburban edge cities around it. Most of the large cities in the United States hit this in the 1970s and into the 1980s. Kansas City is a pretty good example of it. Where does Lawrence fit in comparison to this? Again, if we look at a land use map of Lawrence, you can see, again, certain elements here. the downtown. It's the river running along here. The downtown, South Lawrence Traffic Way skirting out here, and all these new developments along it. Old Lawrence in here. What I'd say is Lawrence is now constructing the last piece in its outer beltway, and it has the beginning of a pretty significant node at 31st and Iowa. It's entering the same phase that large cities hit, as I said, during the 1970s, early 80s, when interstate highways created these suburban edges. To close my part of the list, let's note the similarities between Lawrence and Kansas City, okay? First of all, if we could jump back to that slide, maybe, yeah, thank you. Lawrence has a pretty isolated downtown, as Professor Clark said. It's off here in this northeast corner, very much like the semi-isolated downtown near the river in Kansas City. Lawrence also has this pattern of linear radial expansion out 6th Street and then down Iowa, down 2 corridors. It's not going out radially in all directions like the standard American metropolitan area has. It has little competing development north of the river. Okay, again, a characteristic of Kansas City up until about the 1960s. And then it has the emergence of nodes at these key intersections, 31st in Iowa and 9th in Iowa, and probably something going on out west here. But so far, Lawrence has no competing shopping center like Kansas City had beginning in the 1920s with Club Plaza. And that is the thing that pulled the retail base out of downtown and essentially killed it pretty early. Lawrence doesn't have to suffer with that yet, and I hope it doesn't have to in the future. This has saved Lawrence's downtown so far. It's given value to the neighborhoods that surround the downtown. And my question is, and it'll be answered partially tonight, is how long can Lawrence continue to build a new or a second city to the west without any kind of a commercial core? How far can the city expand and keep commerce concentrated as it is? It's an interesting, unique problem, and I hope people in Lawrence can continue to solve it. So Professor Dormer has quite a bit of light to shed on this question on West Lawrence. I am going to move my notes out of the way and let him in.
Thanks, Mike. You can put my slides on there, please. Certainly one of the most notable segments and certainly one of the most important episodes of city building in Lawrence began in the late 1960s, more or less by chance. Over the last 30 years, which is a relatively long time in a city not yet 150 years old, that part of the city we know now as Alvamar has emerged. Could we start the first slide, please? We get the slides on, please. Has emerged. Alvamar is a part of what I would call the new city. And that is the city which has grown up west of our north-south running arterial of Iowa Street. Alvamar, however, does not encompass all of that area. Its eastern boundary is Cassold. Its northern boundary is 6th Street. Its southern boundary is Clinton Parkway. And its boundary is now the South Lawrence Traffic Way. And within this quadrant lies Alvamar, today the largest single primarily residential development in the United States in a city the size of Lawrence. Alvamar encompasses some 3,000 acres involving over 30 subdivisions, with 8 to 10 more subdivisions now being developed. And it is on land that before 1965 was almost entirely farmland and woods. There are plenty of woods left, but very little farmland in this very large planned community, a community not at all like the one A.D. Searle laid out in 1854 east of Iowa. A street at that time didn't even exist. Mike, Swann, and Dale Nimz and I talked earlier about the physical nature of the original town, and your assigned readings, both for this evening and earlier lectures, cover many details of the original town, its life, and its domestic architecture up to about 1960. I don't intend to go back over that tonight in great detail, but by way of contrast with Alvamar, let me just quickly characterize the old city as a pedestrian city organized as a grid of streets and alleys along both sides of the river, a city with a commercial main street at its center and residential areas surrounding it on all 4 sides. And although the founders of Lawrence did consider the site a propitious one, they paid precious little attention to topography and created their city in a so-called rational way, but with little or no regard for the lay of the land. The old city had none of the characteristics of a New England town plan, in spite of the myth we perpetuate. Alvamar is very different from either the grid city of Cyril or the new organic city, or the more organic city of the New England town with a village. This is one of the subdivisions of Alvamar called the Reserve. You can see that's very different. But in many ways, Alvamar is more rationally planned than the Cyril's town plan and more organic than the New England town, although, as I suggested earlier, Alvamar's main founder, Robert Billings, had no intention in the beginning to build a new city. Bob Billings came from Russell, Kansas in 1955 to attend KU. He was a Summerfield scholar who majored in economics, business, and political science, and he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. He was president of the student body, president of his fraternity, Alpha Tau Omega, and he played guard on the KU basketball team with Wilt Chamberlain, who certainly is one of Bob's great friends. He then became director of financial aid for 10 years before he entered a private development business that changed our city forever. I don't know of a more astute man, politically or financially, than Bob Billings, and I don't know any private citizen who has done more for the whole community of Lawrence and KU than Bob Billings, save perhaps Barkley Clark. Now, you don't have to agree with Bob to really like him, but he is a seductively charming man, a very decent guy, and once you get to know him, you'll find yourself in agreement with him on many issues. Bob Billings is not by any means a run-of-the-mill developer who wants to make money as fast as possible. On the contrary, as a city builder, Bob has taken a long-term view that has reaped many rewards, not necessarily financial, for him. This is why, in my opinion, Bob is much more successful than most other developers, and why he provides one of the most interesting biographies in the history of Lawrence. While he was still director of financial aid at KU, Mel Anderson suggested to Bob, Mel was the superintendent of the Lawrence Country Club. He convinced Bob and his real estate buddy, John McGrew, that Lawrence needed a good public golf course. So in partnership with McGrew, Billings bought 460 acres in 1966 and 67 west of Castle Drive, which at that time was only a gravel road. It wasn't even a gravel road in some places. Billings held, can I go to the, yes, Billings held a 3/4 interest in the deal, and McGrew held the remaining quarter interest. Here you can see the new 18-hole golf course that was named after Bob's parents, Alva and Margreta Billings. Billings and McGrew were willing to take the risk because Ray Wells, the city manager at that time, made a commitment to run a water line out 15th Street to the proposed golf course. And without water, no golf course could succeed in droughty Kansas. And although Lawrence certainly did not have abundance of water at that time, Wells knew that Clinton Reservoir was being planned. And he knew water would be available to Lawrence users by 1980. Billings had not really thought about expanding the golf course into a residential community, but a number of investors contacted him about the possibility of building houses around the golf course. So in 1967, that's the Clinton Lake, so in 1967, he platted a small residential development called Alvamar Estates over here on the right side. Can I get the pointer, please? Over here on the right side of Alvamar, right up here. This was Alvamar Estates. See if I can bring this in any. Yeah, too much. And those lots cost about $2,000 to $100 a lot, and houses at that time cost about $35,000. Both the golf course and the first houses were ready for use on May 15, 1968. One of the keys to his success was location, and the other key to his success was scarcity. Both of these factors were in Billings' favor because Alvamar was located just west of KU, and both KU and Lawrence were growing, as Dr. Swann pointed out. This inevitable growth meant that one subdivision after another would be developed in rapid fashion over on the west side of Lawrence. First Alvamar Heights, then Alvamar Fairway 11 in 1975, Alvamar Oasis. This is all Alvamar, and those different colors are different subdivisions that were developed. In addition to various housing types, quality of housing and cost, Billings created then another 18 golf course, this time a private country club, Alvamar Country Club, and it was completed in 1980. It's over in this area. Here's the first golf course right there on that side. That was the public golf course. And then the private country club golf course was created right there, and here's the country club. All of these areas are different subdivisions that were the larger subdivisions of Alvamar. These are the later ones. This is Yankee Tank out towards South Lawrence Trafficway, and this is the area most recently under development here in Oread West, and this is the northwest area. And then up here, this is 6th Street. This is the north edge. This is the west edge here, South Lawrence Trafficway that comes around here on the south side. And this is Cassold. And this is Clinton Parkway going here like this. And there's the Hy-Vee area right in there. So this is, here's the Orchards, which is another area that I'm going to talk about. So it's kind of this L-shaped fashion, 3,000 acres of very good development. And certainly those golf clubs were excellent. The Orchard subdivision, which has this 9-hole golf course in it, right here, also has 221 lots with 539 dwelling units, 2 churches and a shopping center, as you know, that's right up here on 15th and Cassold. And these golf courses that Bob Billings created are considered some of the finest in the United States. This is the Alvamar Country Club. All of these subdivisions of Alvamar, whether early or late, are so-called planned unit developments, or PUDs, P-U-D-S. And the PUDs are planned very well in comparison to many subdivisions in Lawrence, and particularly in comparison to the almost unplanned scatter sprawl that is occurring in rural Douglas County today. The landscape architect who designed most of this was Brian Kubota, once a partner in the architecture firm of Peters, Williams, and Kubota, and later president and CEO of his own firm, Land Plan Engineering. The PUDs that Kubota designed are really recreational communities within the larger community of Lawrence. The PUD assumes that people want to live in a varied neighborhood setting that has a human scale. Small, in other words, much smaller than large divisions in Johnson County. They don't want a huge suburb that goes on relentlessly in street after street of single-family dwellings. The PUD assumes that people have common interests and lifestyles, and that they tend to group together, that they want security and certain neighborhood services such as schools, shopping. The PUD assumes that people want to live in a city but don't want the traffic noise, although they want easy access to good transportation routes that take them quickly to their work, as you see here in Orchard subdivision. It assumes that people want to integrate living and working and playing into a convenient life. And although the center of Alvamar's PUDs, at the center of all of Alvamar's PUDs, is some kind of recreation, either a golf course or a tennis court or a swimming pool or a racket club. In the case of Yankee Tank development, 110 acres of subdivision being developed on the western edge of Alvamar, the recreational center is a lake, now called Alvamar Lake, that emphasizes water sports and is very close to Clinton Lake. Walking is also a recreation, and enjoying the outdoors is recreation. So the McGrew Natural Preserve north of 15th Street that Billings and McGrew donated and McGrew developed with pathways provides this kind of recreation. Oread West, up in the northeast quadrant, northwest quadrant up here, that was supposed to have another 18-hole golf course. You can see it, the plan for it here, these green areas. However, the city decided to put it in its own golf course, and now it will be simply a natural park and landscape for its center. These PUDs are composed of relatively small lots, although they vary considerably, and being communities within communities, each one of these, here we're getting in close, you can see different size lots as they're drawn out there. Being communities within communities, these PUDs have shorter streets than what you would find in the old city. They take advantage of topography for both financial and environmental reasons. And they include a variety of services close by. So they cluster residential development into these PUDs, and those clusters reduce the cost of sewers and water. And that therefore reduces the cost of development. And it makes it easier for the city to provide fire protection, good transportation, and schools. Sanitary sewers are also designed to serve 2 development lots at once, again reducing the cost of development. Also, the sheer size of Alvamar, eventually 3,000 acres on 55 parcels of land that Billings bought from farmers who were anxious to sell, that size of development made major sewer district benefit districts, and this reduced the cost of development even further. Kubota also reduced the cost of development for Billings by designing streets and buildings that fit into the lay of the land, rather than just applying the so-called rational grid to the land as in the old city, no matter how the hills run or how the waterways go. Planning with the land in mind meant that it cost less to grade those roads. It cost less to excavate those basements and to drain the subdivisions. Now in the old city, where topography was not considered very much, natural disasters tended to occur, such as floods, which would have big effects on Old Lawrence, much bigger effects than necessary. So planning Alvamar with topography in mind meant that the natural setting would be preserved to a large extent, rather than bulldozed into oblivion. This approach to planning in Alvamar created a park-like with many trees, unchanged waterways, untouched valleys and hills, and all of this encouraged birds and animals to remain and flourish in the landscape. And all of these amenities made sense to many people in Lawrence who moved from the old city to the new city. And Alvamar also attracted many people, as Barkley Clark said, who wanted to live in Lawrence and commute to Kansas City or Topeka. Now, just because Billings took advantage of new planning ideas that made Alvamar more feasible and more attractive doesn't mean that Billings has made a huge amount of money from Alvamar, at least not yet. Billings bought the land, the last of which was purchased in 1986, at a slightly higher cost than the cost of agricultural land because of the land's development potential. Billings had to borrow a lot of money to do this. At one point, he had borrowed about $8 million personally. And through his corporation, Inc., he and others borrowed another $5 to $7 million. Today, it would have taken $25 million to accomplish the same thing. You also have to remember that Bob Billings has worked on this project for 30 years, and he's invested and reinvested his money with patience and consideration. He didn't just grab his money and run, as is the case with most developers. Instead, Billings wanted Alvamar to enhance Lawrence, not just exploit the city for his own purposes. Billings, for example, did not support the big cornfield mall, which many developers would have done in his position. Billings didn't support a mall because he didn't think it was good for the community, even though it would have been good for his pocketbook in the short term. Billings doesn't think in the short term, and therefore he saw the value of maintaining downtown Lawrence. Also, Billings could have created a separate city out of Lawrence with its own sewer treatment plant, its own water system, schools, etc., and avoided paying those taxes forever to the old city of Lawrence. But he didn't do that, even though several individuals recommended it. And for that reason, his time and investments have added tremendous economic value to Lawrence and made Lawrence a very attractive community. Without Lawrence, as Billings put it, without Alvamar, as he put it, Lawrence would be Ottawa, which some citizens want, but certainly not the majority. Alvamar, here you see the Racket Club, Alvamar represents a huge tax base for Lawrence. And this tax base really pays for the maintenance of the old city that doesn't generate enough taxes to take care of itself. The lots in Alvamar that were worth $2,000 to $3,000 in 1968 are now worth $60,000 to $150,000 apiece. 10 years ago, the value of new construction in Alvamar completed between 1968 and 1983 was estimated at $69 million. Now that was just construction between 68 and 83, and that would be valued today at about $100 million. And of course, a lot has happened out there in Alvamar since 1983. So this tremendous value that Alvamar represents pays for many public services that people all over the city of Lawrence enjoy. In addition, Bob Billings and his approximately 200 investors paid for all the infrastructural development costs within Alvamar, rather than to rely on the city's tax base to do it. The sewer trench lines out to Alvamar were paid largely by federal grants, not from city money. Therefore, whether you personally like Alvamar to live or not, and many people in the old city don't, you actually have to accept the fact that Alvamar makes the old city of Lawrence possible as we know it today. Without Alvamar, it couldn't be. The development of Alvamar in the 1980s and 1990s extended Billings' idea of a recreational community in significant ways. I asked Bob Billings to take me to his favorite place in Alvamar, and he drove me to Brandon Woods, an extensive adult care facility with several kinds of services, including individual apartments for people who still want to and can live independently, intermediate care units in a kind of dormitory arrangement, and very intensive care units that provide care for those people who can't take care of themselves and the complexities of life. Bob said that Brandon Woods was his favorite place because there is a growing need for adult care living that will continue to burgeon in Lawrence over the next decades. Drury Place, also in Alvamar, adds to Brandon Woods as an alternative living arrangement for people advanced in their years. Now, another very significant development in Alvamar in recent years is the University Corporate and Research Park that is underway in the Oread West subdivision at 15th and Wakarusa. This 300-acre research park provides up to 66 lots, 1.5 to 12 acres in size, for businesses that wish to establish themselves in a park-like environment like Alvamar. Alvamar has great advantages for business investors because it has excellent transportation access to major interstate routes and to an international airport. It provides a variety of housing for employees and is close to a major university that produces the intellectual capital necessary for businesses to compete in a highly technological and rapidly changing world. The cost of labor is lower in Lawrence than the national average, as is the cost of living by about 4%. Further, Rand McNally rated Lawrence #1 in cultural opportunities available among cities with a population of less than 100,000. And these matters are all important to investors. The marketing information for Oread West suggests that this research park provides the space for firms whose businesses depend upon the maintenance of a top-flight business image. And restrictive covenants protect Oread West businesses by ensuring high-quality development and maintenance of quality standards in future years. So there are a lot of advantages, including zoning, fiber optic lines, utilities readily available, and the possibility that the City of Lawrence will provide up to 50% tax abatements for 10 years. So we have a tremendous number of companies in the Oread Development Park District, including Oread Labs, Carousel Trading Company, Microtech Computers, Fairlawn Computing, Midwest Superconductivity, Strata Environmental Services, 2 banks. Here we have the Golf Club Superintendents Association of America and many other businesses and office buildings around and along Wakarusa Road there at 15th Street. Of course, executives and employees who lead these new businesses live in the new nearby residential subdivisions, such as Prestwick, the Masters, Heritage, Alvamar Northwest, and Alvamar West, that admittedly only the relatively rich can afford. The subdivision of Yankee Tank out there near South Lawrence Parkway, not too far along in its development today, will provide additional large lots for businesses as well as lots for very expensive homes that will attract businesses and professional leaders and encourage them to locate their enterprises in Alvamar and in places around Lawrence. Of course, this kind of corporate and research park creates new jobs and new value in Lawrence and produces this tax base that Barkley Clark was talking about. Now, there are other businesses and service nodes that have been strategically placed in and around Alvamar at convenient locations to give Alvamar this neighborhood scale and feeling. There's this Hy-Vee grocery store development that I'm showing you there on the screen, and its attendant retail and eating establishments and entertainment. This creates a community center there at Clinton Parkway and Castle that attracts many people. There's another business node. Get some more light there, please. At 15th and Castle that attracts a large number of people. There are 5 churches and 5 schools and several churches, and all of these kind of nodes create a kind of polycentric, postmodern community that contrasts conceptually and physically with the central downtown of the 19th century. Now, Alvamar and its peripheral developments are not without problems and challenges, even as Bob Billings would attest. Large concentrations of people have many needs, and these needs represent economic opportunities. Developers looking for the fast buck, and history shows that that's what developers are doing, they take advantage of these kinds of opportunities no matter the consequences to the community and its physical appearance. The development along the north side of Alvamar on 6th Street and US Highway 40 to take on the image of another automobile strip like 23rd Street rather than the much preferable commercial nodes we find on Cassold. The new Free State High School may accelerate this tendency. I think we've gone too far. That's not the new Free State High School, of course. If we go back there, we'll probably accelerate this tendency towards strip development unless our city leaders guard against it. Another problem for Alvamar and Bob Billings arose over the conflict concerning the need or apparent need for another public golf course. Billings had been developing this golf course in the northwest sector of the Oriad West subdivision. Much of the grading has been done, just as you see here. But then our city commissioners decided to build their own golf course in an environmentally sensitive area just east of the Clinton Dam. And this decision put an end to Billings' new Oriad West golf enterprise. Now, Lawrence is more or less golfed out. And none of the golf courses are making enough money to cover their own maintenance. So the city decided, I think, can we get some more light on that, please? I think because of sort of a collective guilt vis-a-vis Bob Billings, to purchase the park in the Oriad West area that was going to be the golf course. And that will do something for his development, of course. Another problematic issue was the extension of 15th Street to the South Lawrence Trafficway, clear out west. Now, the SLT is a very big problem, and we'll talk about that with Mark Buehler on the 14th of April. However, owing to cost overruns and the big political difficulties, the traffic exchange that was planned at the end of 15th Street and the SLT was not completed. Although money was left over, as it now stands, the county decided not to use it here. They decided to hold it back in case they could complete the eastern leg of the trafficway and transform this trafficway, which is now a road to nowhere, into a real southern bypass for Lawrence. But Alvamar needs this 15th Street exchange, and although development is still planned along the 15th Street out there in the west, it will be slow because the exchange is not there. There are other large urban design problems that someday will be resolved, and we will live with these problems, good or bad. I'd like to turn just quickly to away from the large-scale characteristics to people who actually live in Alvamar and people who and how they live in these small recreational communities. Of course, there are all kinds of housing, from apartments to fourplexes to single-family dwelling to very expensive mansions here. And in relation to most housing in the world, any of these types of dwellings are very good, but although many of them are quite costly, almost none of them have any architectural distinction. Generally, these dwellings, no matter the type, are stylistically retarded, nostalgic for the past, covered with a plethora of gables and roofs, and they lack all architectural unity. The only house I have seen in Alvamar that has architectural distinction is this one designed for Roger Shimomura and built by Dan Rockhill. However, it caused such a huge uproar among the people of Alvamar, who found it hideous and tasteless. People who otherwise are progressive and well-educated, who drive the best cars, who visit the finest art museums and admire great art, who drink the best wine, and who travel the world around. This is an interesting problem of taste that Rock will address next week, but we don't have great architecture in Alvamar. Well, I only have 30 seconds for the TV portion of this, and I will go on with the class. There are certainly a lot of different people living in Alvamar. Last week, Wayne Props suggested that we really have an apartheid in Lawrence. I don't think that's quite right. That's not quite factual, but I will discuss that more in detail with the class. I do think that we have a lot to owe to Bob Billings. There's much more to say about Alvamar. I want to thank everyone for the interviews they gave me. I just want to say again that without Alvamar, Old Lawrence could not maintain itself. So, Bob Billings, wherever you are, thanks for the memories and thank you for everything you've done and you're still doing in Lawrence.